which I suppose nicely brings us on to our next question, I suppose, or next area of focus, which is all about the people. So I suppose you've been involved in sort of agency, data science, you're now involved with Space 48, which is e-commerce, digital agency, quite people orientated businesses. I suppose certainly when I used to work in private equity, when I speak to other investors, there's always a little bit of nervousness around people heavy businesses, your assets walking out of the door at the end of every day. What are the one or two sort of key factors, I suppose, from your perspective in terms of how you can sort of drive growth in a people business, but also how you can get investors comfortable with that sort of people-centric nature of some of those industry sectors?
Yeah, I think that's key, and particularly for scale dictates that quite a bit as well, because if you've got a founder-led business, quite often a lot of those relationships sit with that individual, and if that individual's sort of looking to exit the business, the goodwill sits with that individual because the relationships with that individual, and if they exit, then the value exits too. And even in a sort of a bit larger business, still quite often a lot of those relationships can quite often sit within a handful of people. And again, if one of those leaves, the goodwill sits with them quite often with the client relationship, and away they go. And the classic ones are sort of professional services, lawyers, financial advisors, headhunters, absolutely, and to a degree, again, senior people within agency land, absolutely. And I think the thing that sort of de-risks that is just really looking at how you make sure that the business owns a relationship rather than an individual within it. And part of that's contractually, but it's always quite difficult to enforce those contracts in truth when it comes to it, because if the client approaches the other individual, they've not necessarily fallen foul of any of the soliciting restrictions. So it's always difficult. But I do think there's contractually, but then there's also building out really a client services or account management function where that relationship is run for the business by a group of individuals rather than one person. And as a business scales, that naturally happens. That basically, the founder becomes an escalation point rather than the relationship, day-to-day relationship point.
Yeah.
Or becomes a client sponsor. So typically that's what happens. You end up with people being client sponsors or points of escalation, and you've got a team which are entirely sort of replaceable. Who manage that relationship on a relatively high level basis, but also on a day-to-day basis. And I think that is the key, that you end up with that sort of approach. And within the account management teams, I actually think it's quite good from time to time to change those teams around,
right,
for the people in them, but also for the clients. Actually, it just gives more. I think the worst thing you can have is you've got an account management team where one account manager has been looking after the same relationship for 10 years. That isn't healthy on either side, I don't think.
That's interesting, because that is something you come across quite a lot, is those long-established account relationships. And almost, I suppose from account directors' perspective, sometimes that is why they are, they move, is because they know they can take that account with them to a at some point, even if it's not immediately. But that's interesting. Yeah. Freshening it up every now and again can actually be advantageous.
Yeah, and I think in general, and certainly in a lot of businesses, there's always the worry of key people leaving, and I think quite often sort of founders are held hostage by the risk of these people leaving. And I think if experience has taught me anything, is that that's probably wrong. You should and actually, when some of these key people leave, that you thought actually the whole thing would crash down upon you. There's been little impacts, when they went. You bring somebody new in who brings in a whole load more energy, and actually things move forward when actually you thought things were going to drop off a cliff. And I do think that's a behaviour you see time and time again in people businesses, that people get too focused on the risk of somebody leaving, and you know, and it, you know, in experience, that doesn't really have anywhere near as big an impact as I think. And actually, you know, keeping new talent coming into business is probably one of the most important things about it moving forward, because I think when you've got an established team who's been doing it, say for 10 years, the same team, it stagnates. You need that sort of churn, if you like, to keep it moving forward.
Yeah, I suppose the things that we see from clients in those sorts of businesses, and we have it ourselves in our own business, is that obviously kind of keeping your retention as high as possible, you know, having positive culture, you know, good rewards, recognition, all that sort of stuff obviously helps. I think if you're investor backed and in a sort of a growth and a scale up, obviously the only way you can scale is by adding more heads. And I think that's the challenge sometimes is for people, is that it always takes them longer to recruit those heads than they anticipate, and longer for those heads to start really contributing to the business than they probably anticipated, which is again why I think some investors get nervous, because they can see a business plan slipping quite quickly if that recruitment and retention doesn't pan out as expected. I think, and it's a challenge for all businesses, isn't it? We see it all the time, is that getting the people in at the right rates and at the right time without lowering the quality bar as well is important.
Yeah. And I think the other thing you sort of see sometimes, and partly because of that, there's a need to just grow to scale it. But quite often there's no exit signs in businesses. So the answer is to add on additional resource rather than say, actually, you know, we've got the wrong shape of our resource, and what we need is, you know, some roles over here. And they tend to be recruited in addition to what you've got over here. Whereas in truth is, what you need to do is you need to fund those new roles out of some of the roles that aren't working over here. I think that's something that people quite often don't take on, and you end up with this sort of unfortunately sometimes dysfunctional kind of organisation, or roles that just aren't performing, but because it gets too complicated and you end up, you know, so I think if you can keep, you know, and it's difficult, so to try and keep that a small, tight sort of organisational structure as you can. Rather than just adding, and that's a classic one you see as businesses are trying to scale quickly. They just keep adding roles and new structures, and it gets more and more complicated. And at some point, you know, you've got to sort that out.
Yeah, no, we see that a lot. I mean, you know, we spend a lot of time advising clients, you know, on the structure of the business, the balance of the teams in the business. And I think partly, I don't know whether it's driven by just the current era that we're in, but you find founders particularly are obsessed with recruiting leaders, and you kind of, not everyone in your business can or needs to be a leader. You need some doers and some, you know, deliverers, as well as people that can lead. And also I think in early stage businesses particularly, we quite often see sort of C-suite titles handed out quite early, where the people haven't got the C-suite experience, and then the founder's almost painted himself into a bit of a corner because he thinks he's got a C-suite team, but he hasn't got C-suite experience. And we're always saying to people, you know, you can give people titles, but it doesn't have to be a C-suite title from day one. They could be a head of or a lead or whatever it might be, but do that progressively over time rather than straight away. And that's it. It's difficult because I think founders read all the stuff that's out there and think this is what you should do, but it can cause you some issues further down the line.
And I think that one of the things that you see, and one of the good things about sometimes going with private equity, is that at that point they actually do some sort of due diligence on the team and put them through some form of an exercise to understand, you know, what they're like and how that team would work as a whole. And I think that is a thing that quite often missing. You can have a team, but there's just a whole area where all of them are either alike or actually they're too far apart. And you know, I think to create that winning team, I think quite often that's forgotten. That, you know, each role is recruited in and of itself rather than looking at what's the mix. And it's not the mix of specific experience or expertise. It's actually it's whether you've got people who are like one-level strategists, people who are really sort of like complete polishers or whatever those different elements are. So I do think that's really important, and that kind of role in making a move from, again, founder-led business into maybe a private equity situation where you're going to scale the business is, what team have you got? And because the team that got you to that point isn't necessarily the team that's going to get you to grow, get a 3 times return in 3 or 5 years, and then maybe go again after that. And it's those other sort of elements that are really key. And I think that's, as I said, my experience so far with private equity, quite often that's part of the due diligence process. So you can, coming in as a non-exec to that, you can kind of recognise where those gaps might be, or where their development might be.
Yeah, and I think that's something, obviously, we've got our own sort of leadership dynamics platform, which, whilst it's not a due diligence tool as such, it is being used by private equity to do that sort of team evaluation, particularly from that, getting the balance of that team right. So, do the behaviours balance? Have they got the right mix of tactical people and strategic people? And I think founders do struggle from a loyalty perspective sometimes, people that they've established a business with, that they might be friends or family members sometimes, but I'm always a big believer that the business's journey it's like a bus journey, isn't it? And some people get on and off the bus as it goes on its route, and some people but you've just got to adapt and change as the business changes. So I think it's definitely not without its challenges, but clearly there are opportunities to drive growth from a people perspective, and that's something that we help, obviously, clients do.